Hey guys, Yips here coming at you with another video, and today we're going to talk about why Affliction was such a nightmare for Blizzard to deal with throughout Legion. I think talking about this is important just because it will help you guys better understand game mechanics in World of Warcraft, and anytime that can happen, it'll just be a good experience for you guys because hopefully it'll help you improve as a player. So why was Affliction just such a nightmare for Blizzard? Well, Blizzard as a gaming company, they've said many times throughout all of their games that they don't like making drastic changes to classes throughout the course of an expansion, a patch, whatever it might be. The reason being is because players that don't play this game constantly are not keeping up with the patches. Logging in one day and having your buttons do totally different things is very confusing to them. It leads to a very negative experience, and that's something Blizzard wants to avoid, and rightfully so. It does make sense. So why was Affliction changed so much throughout Legion? Why was Affliction constantly having to be buffed, having to be nerfed, and what was happening with the development team to where this was going on? So we all remember Affliction at the start of Emerald Nightmare. It was not a very strong spec. Your artifact weapon, the souls that you generated were completely RNG on a boss fight, so whether you had good reap up time or bad reap up time was entirely just random. You didn't have the proper legendaries yet because everyone was fishing. Obviously, Hood of the Eternal Disdain was extremely overpowered for Affliction, but even with that, Affliction was nowhere near competing any of the other specs. Our artifact weapon was bugged on a lot of bosses. Soul Flame didn't work off some monsters. Wrath of Consumption wasn't being generated off most creatures when they died. You did not gain Reap on kill effect until later into the expansion, but when they did implement that, obviously things changed quite drastically. So Affliction was kind of in a rut, right? Soul Effigy wasn't giving the proper amount of shards. There was just so much wrong with Affliction upon release, and the main reason is because the way that Blizzard wanted to develop Affliction in beta to where their artifact weapon randomly spawned creatures that you would kill to give you these buffs, they completely scrapped that idea, and that kind of left a half-broken spec upon Legion release. So what happened when they added all the fixes, they kind of changed Affliction to where it was performing all right when they did all of the changes to where our on-death effects were working with monsters in Raid, that being Soul Flame and Wrath of Consumption. They made Reap more consistent in Nighthold to where monsters that died gave you Reap, they gave you Wrath of Consumption. What kind of stuff really just propelled Affliction to be this overpowered spec when in Emerald Nightmare, and even for parts of Trial of Valor, it was considered to be one of the weakest specs in the game? Well, part of the reason why Affliction became so overpowered is because of the amount of modifiers that we have, and because of the amount of modifiers that Blizzard kept giving Affliction. Anytime that you give a class repeated damage percent modifier buffs instead of buffing an ability flat out by the base damage, and even then it's still really good, but anytime you add additional percent modifiers and buff the base damage of abilities, things are going to scale out of control. That's just the way that World of Warcraft works. So that Blizzard, we had a 15% Contagion. We had a 70% Malefic Grasp in Nighthold, right? We had our 10%, I think it was 10% additional unstable Affliction damage in Nighthold as well. And then we had our legendaries, and we had our artifact ability weapon that doubled all of our traits, which further increased our damage by a percent, plus the flat 10% damage output that our artifact weapon gave. So we had like 7 to 8% damage modifiers going in to each and every one of our abilities that were also buffed at a core. So if you remember in Nighthold, our unstable afflictions were critting, at least mine were with Perdition, upwards of 1.4 million. My UAs at the end of Legion weren't even hitting that hard because we didn't have as many modifiers. So when Blizzard takes a spec that's not performing well, and then alters it to where they add a ton of modifiers and change the way that the class works to where it's functioning in a better place, the class can scale out of hand. And we saw that throughout Tomb of Sargeras, throughout even Antares the Burning Throne, Affliction was getting nerfed almost every week at the start of each patch. The reason being is because as Affliction got more gear, all of those percent modifiers became more powerful. If you want to think about it like this, say you deal 100 damage and you have a 70% modifier, then you would deal 170 damage. New patch comes, all of a sudden you're dealing 200 damage. Well, that 70% modifier all of a sudden became 140 damage instead of 70 damage. And when you have more multipliers going in on top of one another, that effect just gets scaled out of control. So that's why with each and every raid tier that was released, Affliction just kept becoming more and more powerful. We just had all of these things built into our artifact weapon that were all of a sudden being able to be utilized in a raid setting. We had all of these modifiers working in tandem together in order to just create this most busted raid spec that really limited design space for Blizzard. Like, Blizzard had to keep in mind Affliction Warlocks when they were balancing bosses. And that's not something you ever want to have as a developer. You never want to think, oh, well, Affliction locks, oh, well, they have all these things where they can, drain soul for soul shards, they can get Wrath of Consumption forever, they can, have Soul Flame proccing on everything. And you never want to be thinking, oh, man, we really can't make this boss because Affliction would just be too darn good on it. Blizzard cannot be designing in a space like that. And any sort of boss that they would have wanted to create that spawned a lot of ads, that had multiple bosses to which you can abuse absolute corruption, anything like that was just almost out of the question, just because of how much of an impact Affliction Warlocks could have on fights like that. And Blizzard didn't want to just like trash Affliction into the ground because there were so many players playing it. So I think the big mistake that Blizzard made here with regards to Affliction Warlocks in Legion was they really underestimated the power of modifiers, which doesn't really make sense to me because I feel like the people of Blizzard have a really good idea of how the base mechanics of the game work. And, when they gave Affliction a 70, or even, I think at first it was 100% of Malefic Grasp, I was just sitting here like, Affliction's already doing okay. And you just gave us another 70% modifier. And then when they came in with the Ren Soul change, which made it so we had 100% rip-up time, I was just going like, what are you doing? And obviously we saw many changes to that on the beta server to where a lot of those abilities were nerfed. For example, Malefic Grasp was changed to 70% and then later 25%. And, I think if Blizzard had to go back and do it all over again, I really think they wouldn't have made all the changes that they made to Affliction. I really think they would have done it in a different way. I think that they would have changed to where our modifiers weren't as powerful, but our base core of damage was a lot higher. So we saw that change happen at the end of the expansion where Malefic Grasp was reduced to 25%, but all of our base numbers were, increased by a drastic proportion to make up for losing that 70% modifier to keep Affliction in competition. I think Blizzard would change our artifact weapon to not work quite the same that it did. I think, Blizzard would make a lot of changes that they didn't throughout the course of the expansion for Affliction Warlocks, and that's why it was really such a problem class for Blizzard in terms of designing, things around it. So hopefully this video, made you guys think about Affliction. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully now you have a better understanding about what classes will be OP as gear progression happens throughout the expansion. You can look at your abilities and say, okay, I have this modifying with this. As I get more gear, maybe this will become a viable option. If not, maybe it was a little bit of an interesting talk to you about how Blizzard kind of messed up in Legion with Affliction. And, moving forward, we won't really be seeing, all of those modifiers being added to classes anymore, certainly. So yeah, thanks for watching. Hopefully this video gave you guys a little bit of insight towards the class, and I'll talk to you guys later.